The crystal chandelier caught the light just as Eleanor Price's reading glasses shattered against the polished marble floor of the Cedar Ridge Country Club. 160 wedding guests fell silent. The kind of silence that follows lightning, heavy and electric, waiting for thunder that never comes. Eleanor's weathered hand pressed against her cheek where the red mark was already blooming, a crimson badge of something that had been building for months, maybe years. She looked down at the broken lenses, each fragment reflecting the golden ballroom lights like scattered stars. 70 years of living, of surviving her husband's death, of working 3 days a week at the community library to keep her hands busy and her mind sharp. And it had come to this, being slapped by her son's new wife in front of everyone who mattered to them. The wedding dress rustled as Savannah Cole stepped back, her manicured fingers still trembling from the impact. Her voice, usually so controlled and sweet when others were listening, now carried the sharp edge of someone whose mask had finally slipped. "She's being selfish," Savannah announced to the stunned crowd, her chest rising and falling with the kind of breathlessness that comes from crossing a line you can never uncross. "We just need the keys to her apartment. For her own good, the senior living facility has a waiting list." Eleanor's son Michael stood frozen 3 feet away, his rented tuxedo making him look like a stranger, his mouth open and closed like a fish pulled from water. And in that moment, Eleanor saw not the confident man who sold insurance policies with a firm handshake, but the little boy who used to hide behind her legs when strangers talked too loud. The little boy who had chosen silence over standing up for his mother. She could feel the weight of every eye in that ballroom. The society ladies with their pearl necklaces and practiced smiles, the business associates who knew her only as Michael's mom, the young couples who probably thought she was just another elderly relative taking up space at the head table. None of them knew about the Toyota Camry she'd been driving since 2011, still running strong at 150,000 miles. None of them knew about the cardigan she'd mended 6 times rather than buy a new one, or the way she made her morning coffee in a pot that had belonged to her grandmother. What they definitely didn't know was what she spent 45 minutes discussing with Raymond Chun that very afternoon, speaking in quiet, measured tones of someone who'd been waiting for this moment longer than she cared to admit. The band had stopped playing somewhere between the slap and the awful silence that followed. A waiter stood motionless near the cake table, a tray of champagne flutes balanced in his hands like an offering to gods who had stopped listening. Eleanor bent slowly, her knees protesting, and picked up the largest piece of her broken glasses. The world had gone soft around the edges, but she could see clearly enough for what came next. She looked at Savannah, really looked at her. The designer dress that cost more than most people made in a month, the engagement ring that caught the light with every gesture, the carefully applied makeup that couldn't quite hide the hardness that had crept into her features over the past year. Then she looked at Michael, her only child, standing there in his expensive suit with his shoulders curved inward like he was trying to disappear. "The keys to my apartment," Eleanor repeated slowly, testing the words like she was learning a new language. Her voice carried across the ballroom with the kind of clarity that comes from decades of reading stories aloud to children at the library, of making every word count. "To my 1,200 square foot apartment overlooking Lake Union, the one your new wife had appraised 3 weeks ago while I was at work." The silence shifted, became something else entirely. Somewhere in the crowd, someone's wine glass clinked against a table. A woman's voice whispered, "Did she say appraised?" Eleanor reached into her small purse, the same black leather bag she carried to church and grocery stores and parent-teacher conferences for 15 years, and pulled out her cell phone. The screen was cracked from when she dropped it in the library parking lot last month, but it worked just fine. Her fingers, steady despite everything, scrolled through her contacts until she found the name she was looking for. "Raymond," she said when he answered on the second ring. Her voice carried the kind of calm that comes from finally knowing exactly what you're going to do. "It's Eleanor. I need you to bring those documents we discussed." "Yes, all of them. Cedar Ridge Country Club, Grand Ballroom. 30 minutes would be perfect." She ended the call and slipped the phone back into her purse. Around her, the murmur of confused voices was growing louder, but she ignored them all. Instead, she reached up and touched the spot on her cheek where Savannah's hand had landed, feeling the heat of it, the sting that would fade but the memory that wouldn't. For 3 months, She'd listen to them talk about her future, like she wasn't in the room. The senior living community with its comprehensive care and age-appropriate activities. The way Savannah would pat her arm and smile that practice smile and say things like, "It's really for the best, Mom," always calling her Mom, though the word never sounded quite right coming from her lips. For 3 months, she watched Michael nod along, his face wearing the expression of a man who convinced himself he was doing the right thing, even as his eyes couldn't quite meet hers. She listened to them discuss square footage and property values and proximity to the freeway, like they were talking about selling an old car instead of dismantling the life she'd built for herself. What they hadn't counted on was that Eleanor Price, despite her secondhand sweaters and her practical shoes and her careful way of stretching every dollar, despite the way she clipped coupons and drove her old Camry and worked at a library for the simple pleasure of being useful, what they hadn't counted on was that she was nobody's fool. The ballroom side door opened with a soft whoosh of air, and Eleanor turned toward it with the kind of anticipation that comes from knowing exactly who's about to walk through. Raymond Chun stepped inside, tall and sharp in his charcoal suit, carrying a leather briefcase that looked like it'd seen its share of important meetings and difficult conversations. As he made his way across the dance floor, weaving between tables of abandoned dinners and half-empty wine glasses, Eleanor felt something shift inside her chest. Not anger. Anger was too hot, too uncontrolled for what she needed right now. This was something cooler, more precise. This was the feeling of a woman who had been patient for exactly as long as patience served her, and not one moment longer. The fragments of her broken glasses sparkled on the marble floor like promises she was finally ready to keep. Raymond Chun moved through a crowd of wedding guests with the purposeful stride of a man who had delivered difficult news in elegant venues before. His briefcase gleamed under the ballroom lights, expensive leather worn soft from years of carrying documents that changed lives. Eleanor watched him approach, noting how conversations died in his wake. Not from recognition, but from the unmistakable aura of legal authority that seemed to travel with him like cologne. She had met Raymond 12 years ago when her husband died, when grief had made even simple decisions feel like climbing mountains in thick fog. He had guided her through probate and estate planning with the kind of patient professionalism that never felt condescending, never made her feel like just another confused widow who didn't understand money. Over the years, their relationship had evolved beyond strictly professional. He was perhaps the only person alive who knew the full scope of what Eleanor and her late husband had quietly built together. "Mrs. Price," Raymond said as he reached her, his voice carrying just enough volume to be heard by the nearest tables, but maintaining the discreet tone of someone who understood the theater of these moments. "I have the documents you requested." Savannah, who had been whispering urgently to Michael near the head table, turned sharply at the sound of an unfamiliar voice. Her eyes fixed on the briefcase with the kind of predatory attention that Eleanor had seen before, usually when bills arrived or investment statements were discussed. "Who is this?" she demanded, her voice still carrying the brittle edge from their earlier confrontation. "This is my financial advisor and trust attorney," Eleanor replied, straightening her shoulders in a way that made her seem taller than her 5'4" frame. "Raymond Chun from Cascade Wealth Management." The name meant nothing to most of the guests, but Eleanor noticed how Victor Caldwell, the club's event manager, suddenly appeared at the edge of their circle. Victor had been in the hospitality business long enough to recognize the signs of an evening that was about to become complicated, and complicated evenings usually ended with questions about payment. Michael finally found his voice, though it came out higher than usual. "Mom, what's going on? Why do you need a lawyer at my wedding?" Eleanor studied her son's face, really studied it, for perhaps the first time in months. The worry lines around his eyes had deepened since Christmas. His skin had the pale, slightly puffy look of someone who wasn't sleeping well, who was drinking too much coffee and eating too many meals from vending machines. She had noticed these changes, but had attributed them to wedding stress, to the normal pressures of a man starting his 30s with a new wife and new responsibilities. Now, looking at him with the clarity that sometimes comes from shock, she realized she had been willfully blind to other possibilities. "Raymond," she said, never taking her eyes off Michael, "would you please read the first document? The one about the rental guarantee." Raymond opened his briefcase with practiced efficiency and withdrew a folder thick enough to suggest months of preparation. He cleared his throat, and Eleanor noticed how the gesture commanded attention from even the most distracted guests. Conversations at neighboring tables stuttered and died. "This is a formal notice of termination," Raymond began, his voice carrying the kind of authority that comes from reading similar documents in courtrooms and boardrooms. "Effective immediately, Eleanor Price is withdrawing her financial guarantee for the rental property at 414 Pine Street, Unit 12B, currently occupied by Michael James Price and Savannah Marie Cole Price." The words hung in the air like smoke from an extinguished candle. Eleanor watched her son's face go through a series of expressions: confusion, recognition, and finally a pale understanding that made her heart ache even as her resolve hardened. "Mom," Michael said, and now his voice was definitely smaller. "You can't just—" "The monthly rent for said property is $3,200, Raymond continued, consulting his notes. "Mrs. Eleanor Price has been providing payment guarantee and coverage for the past 14 months, during which time the actual tenants had contributed an average of $847 per month toward their rental obligation." Savannah's carefully applied makeup couldn't hide the way color drained from her cheeks. She grabbed Michael's arm hard enough to wrinkle his jacket sleeve. "You told me she was just helping out temporarily," she hissed, but in the balloon's acoustics, her whisper carried like a shout. "There's more," Raymond said, flipping to the next page. "This notice also terminates the monthly financial assistance of $3,800, previously transferred to Michael Price's checking account on the 15th of each month for the past 8 months. The number hit the crowd like a physical force. Eleanor heard sharp intakes of breath from multiple directions. Someone's fork clattered against a plate. Near the bar, she caught sight of Nora Bennett, her neighbor and closest friend, whose expression had shifted from confusion to something that looked like pride mixed with concern. Nora had been there the afternoon 2 weeks ago when Savannah had brought a real estate appraiser to Eleanor's apartment, claiming they were just looking at market values for insurance purposes. Nora had watched from her own window as the man measured rooms and took photographs, and had mentioned it to Eleanor that evening with the careful neutrality of someone who suspected drama but hoped to be wrong. "Additionally," Raymond continued, turning to a new document, "Mrs. Price is formally withdrawing her guarantee for wedding-related expenses at Cedar Ridge Country Club. The outstanding balance of $58,000 will need to be addressed by the contracted parties before the conclusion of this evening's event." The silence that followed was different from before. This wasn't the shocked quiet of witnessing a family argument. This was a heavy stillness that comes when money, real money, suddenly becomes everyone's problem. Victor Caldwell stepped forward, his professional smile strained but intact. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but perhaps we could discuss the financial arrangements privately? We certainly want a night to be perfect for everyone." Eleanor looked at him with something approaching sympathy. He was just doing his job, caught between his club's policies and a situation that was rapidly spiraling beyond anyone's control. But she had passed the point where other people's comfort could dictate her choices. "No need for privacy," she said, surprising herself at how steady her voice sounded. "I think everyone here should understand what's been happening." She turned to face the broader crowd, these people who had come to celebrate love and family and new beginnings, who had dressed in their finest clothes and brought carefully chosen gifts and expected nothing more dramatic than a champagne toast and some dancing. They deserved to know why their evening was dissolving into something else entirely. "For the past year," Eleanor said, her voice carrying to the far corners of the ballroom, "I've been supporting my son and his new wife financially while they planned this wedding. I did it quietly, the way I've always helped family, without fanfare, without conditions, and without question." Michael tried to interrupt. "Mom, please." "What I didn't realize," Eleanor continued, "is that my help was being interpreted as weakness, that my willingness to support them was seen as evidence that I was too old, too confused, and too vulnerable to make my own decisions about my own life." She pulled another document from her purse. Not something Raymond had prepared, but something she'd been carrying for 3 weeks, ever since the day she had come home from the library to find Savannah entertaining that appraiser in her living room. "This," she said, holding up the paper, "is a petition for adult guardianship, filed by Michael Price and Savannah Cole Price, requesting legal authority to make financial and residential decisions on my behalf due to alleged cognitive decline and inability to manage my own affairs. The gasp that went through the crowd was audible. Eleanor felt a strange satisfaction in finally naming the thing that had been lurking around the edges of every conversation, every suggestion about senior living, every concerned comment about her old car and outdated apartment. She looked directly at Michael, whose face had gone from pale to gray. Did you really think I would find out? The petition for guardianship felt heavy in Eleanor's hands, though it was only 3 pages of legal language that boiled down to a simple, devastating claim that she was no longer capable of making rational decisions about her own life. She had read it so many times over the past 3 weeks that she had memorized certain phrases: diminished capacity, financial vulnerability, residing in substandard conditions despite available resources. The irony wasn't lost on her. Here she stood, having orchestrated this entire evening's revelation, having spent months gathering evidence and preparing contingencies, having arranged for legal counsel and financial documentation with the precision of a general planning a campaign. And yet her own son had sworn under oath that she lacked the mental capacity to choose where to live. Michael's hand shook as he reached for the petition. His voice came out cracked and small. "Mom, it wasn't supposed to be. Savannah said it was just a precaution. She said if something happened to you, we needed to be able to help." Something like, "What?" Eleanor asked. Around them, the wedding guests had arranged themselves in a loose circle, no longer pretending to carry on separate conversations. This had become the evening's entertainment, though Eleanor doubted anyone was enjoying the show. Savannah stepped closer, and Eleanor could see desperation beginning to replace the earlier anger in her face. When people's masks slip, Eleanor had learned from her years working with library patrons. They usually double down on performance rather than abandon it entirely. "We were worried about you," Savannah said, and her voice carried the practiced sincerity of someone who had learned to weaponize concern. "Living alone in that apartment, driving that old car. We just wanted to make sure you had support, proper care. In a senior living facility that costs $4,800 per month," Eleanor interrupted. "I called them, Mountain View Senior Community. Beautiful place. Excellent care. And according to their admissions director, you had already put down a $500 deposit to hold a room for me." The color that had drained from Savannah's face earlier now seemed to flee entirely, leaving her looking almost translucent under the ballroom lights. That was, "We just wanted to be prepared. Prepared for when the guardianship was approved, and you could force me to sell my apartment to pay for it." Eleanor finished. "The same apartment that, according to the appraiser you commissioned, is worth $485,000, more than enough to cover several years of senior care, especially after you subtract your management fees." She had said the words with the calm detachment of someone reading a grocery list, but their impact rippled through the crowd like a stone thrown into still water. Eleanor heard whispered conversations starting at the outer edges of the circle, saw people pulling out phones to text others who weren't there. Raymond consulted another document. "Mrs. Price, would you like me to explain the property holdings that were not disclosed in the guardianship petition?" This was the moment Eleanor had been both dreading and anticipating. For 12 years, she had lived quietly with the secret of what she and her husband had built together. Not through flashy investments or risky speculation, but through patient, careful decisions made over 3 decades of marriage. They had lived below their means, invested consistently, and purchased real estate when opportunities presented themselves. By the time her husband died, they had accumulated wealth that seemed almost fictional to Eleanor, who still remembered stretching dollars for groceries as a young mother. She had chosen to live simply not from necessity, but from preference. The Toyota Camry ran perfectly well. Her apartment had everything she needed. Working at the library gave her purpose and community. She had no desire for luxury, no need to prove anything to anyone. But apparently, her contentment had been interpreted as vulnerability by people who couldn't imagine choosing simplicity when you could afford excess. "My late husband and I," Eleanor said, "own an 8,000 square foot commercial building in the Belltown district. Currently lease to 3 businesses with combined monthly income of $12,400. We also maintain investment accounts with Cascade Wealth Management totaling $4.8 million, and vacation home on the Oregon coast that we purchased outright in 2003. The silence that followed was so complete that Eleanor could hear the air conditioning system humming through the ballroom's vents. Someone's phone buzzed against the table, the sound unnaturally loud in the stillness. Michael sat down heavily in the nearest chair, his carefully styled hair falling across his forehead in a way that made him look very young and very lost. "I didn't know," he said, and his voice was barely above a whisper. "Mom, I swear I didn't know about any of that." Eleanor looked at her son and felt her heart break and mend simultaneously. She believed him about the money, at least. He genuinely hadn't known the scope of her resources because she had never told him. She had seen too many families destroyed by wealth, had watched inheritance tear siblings apart and turn children into vultures circling their parents' sickbeds. But there were other things he had known. He had known about the monthly transfers that covered his rent and expenses. He had known about the credit card payments and the car insurance, and the steady stream of support that had allowed him and Savannah to live beyond their means while planning this expensive wedding. Most importantly, he had known that his mother was sharp, competent, and fully capable of making her own decisions. And yet he had signed his name to documents claiming otherwise. The guardianship petition lists your debts at $127,000. Eleanor said gently. Credit cards, car loans, student loans, medical bills from Savannah's emergency room visit last year. It also mentions that you're 3 months behind on rent despite my assistance, and that you've borrowed against your 401k twice in the past 18 months. She pulled another paper from her purse, this one a printout from her bank's online portal, showing months of transfers. I've been giving you nearly $8,000 every month for over a year. Where did it go, Michael? Her son looked up at her with eyes that reminded her of the little boy who had broken her grandmother's vase and tried to hide the pieces rather than confess. Savannah handles our finances, he said weakly. Eleanor turned to her daughter-in-law, who stood frozen near the head table like a deer caught in headlights. I'm sure she does. Tell me, Savannah, about your consulting business. Lifestyle and image consulting, according to your social media. How many clients do you have? Savannah's mouth opened and closed without sound. Around them, Eleanor could feel the crowd's attention, like a physical weight. These people had come expecting speeches about love and commitment, not a public accounting of debt and deception. But sometimes, Eleanor reflected, the most important conversations were the ones that happened when everyone was watching. I hired a private investigator, Eleanor continued, her voice still calm but carrying a new edge of steel. A very discreet woman named Priya Singh, who specializes in financial background checks. Would you like to know what she found? She didn't wait for an answer. Your consulting business exists primarily on Instagram, where you post photos of expensive clothes and vacations funded by the money I send to Michael. Your actual income last year was $3,400, all of it from a part-time position at a makeup counter that you quit 6 months ago. You have 2 maxed-out credit cards, a car lease you can't afford, and a shopping addiction that you've been financing to my son's guilt and my generosity. The words landed like physical blows. Savannah staggered backward until she bumped against the cake table, her hand flying to her throat in a gesture that looked almost theatrical. But Eleanor could see real fear in her eyes now. Not the angry defensiveness from earlier, but the desperate panic of someone whose carefully constructed world was collapsing in real time. I never meant for it to go this far, Savannah whispered, and for the first time all evening, her voice sounded genuine. I was trying to help. Michael deserves better than. She gestured vaguely around the room. I wanted to give him a life that matched what he's worth. And you decided that required getting rid of me, Eleanor said. It wasn't a question, and Savannah didn't try to deny it. Instead, she began to cry. Not the pretty, delicate tears of a movie heroine, but the ugly, desperate sobbing of someone who had run out of options and excuses. Eleanor felt no satisfaction in her daughter-in-law's breakdown. If anything, she felt a deep sadness for this young woman who had convinced herself that love meant orchestrating lies, that security required betraying the people who offered help. But sadness didn't change what needed to happen next. Victor Caldwell cleared his throat, the sound cutting through Savannah's sobs with the authority of a man who had handled enough society scandals to recognize when damage control was needed. His face maintained his professional neutrality, but Eleanor could see the calculations happening behind his eyes. Reputation, liability, an immediate question of who was going to pay for the evening's remaining expenses. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced to the crowd, "perhaps we could allow the family some privacy to resolve these matters. The bar remains open, and we have a lovely dessert selection." "No," Eleanor said firmly. "No privacy. This conversation began in public, because that's where the lie was told. That's where it ends." She looked around the ballroom at faces she recognized from Michael's life. College friends, co-workers, neighbors from the apartment complex where he and Savannah lived. People who had probably heard stories about his difficult mother and her stubborn refusal to accept help. People who had been fed carefully crafted narratives about Eleanor's supposed decline, her alleged inability to manage her own affairs. They deserved to know the truth, but more than that, Eleanor realized she needed to say it aloud. For months, she had carried the weight of other people's versions of her story. Tonight, she was reclaiming her own narrative. "I work 3 days a week at the Greenwood Branch Library," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the room. "I help children with homework, teach seniors how to use computers, and manage the community outreach programs. Last month, I organized a job fair that connected 47 people with employment. I drive myself to work, pay my own bills, maintain my own apartment, and make my own decisions about my health care and my future." Michael looked up from where he sat slumped in his chair. "Mom, I know you're capable. I never said you weren't. You signed a legal document stating that I have diminished cognitive capacity." Eleanor interrupted. "You swore under oath that I cannot make rational decisions about my own welfare. You petitioned a judge to take away my legal rights as an adult human being." The words hung in the air like an indictment. Eleanor saw several of the wedding guests exchange glances, their faces showing the kind of discomfort that comes from witnessing something too intimate for public consumption. But she was past caring about other people's comfort. "Do you know what that petition would have meant?" she continued. "If it had been approved, you would have had the legal authority to force me from my home, to control my medical care, to make decisions about my daily life without my consent. I would have become a legal child, dependent on your judgment for everything from what I eat for breakfast to whether I'm allowed to drive my own car." Savannah lifted her head from her hands. Her makeup had run in dark streaks down her cheeks, making her look younger and more vulnerable than Eleanor had ever seen her. "We just wanted what was best for you," she said, but the words came out hollow, like an echo of something she no longer believed herself. "What you wanted," Eleanor replied, "was access to my assets and removal of my autonomy. There's a difference." Raymond had been standing quietly throughout the exchange, but now he stepped forward with another document. "Mrs. Price, should we discuss the other findings from Ms. Singh's investigation?" Eleanor nodded. This was the part she had dreaded most, because it would hurt Michael in ways that money and betrayal couldn't touch. But secrets, she had learned, were like cancer. They grew in darkness and silence, becoming more dangerous the longer they remained hidden. 3 months ago, she said, looking directly at her son, you met with an attorney named David Kurtz to discuss the timeline for guardianship proceedings. You asked specific questions about how quickly assets could be liquidated once a guardian was appointed, and whether there were any restrictions on a guardian selling property to pay for care expenses. Michael's face went gray. How did you? Mr. Kurtz's assistant is married to one of my library volunteers, Eleanor explained. Small world, especially when you're asking questions about elderly exploitation laws. She pulled out a photograph, a printout from Priya's investigation that showed Michael leaving the law office on a Tuesday afternoon when he should have been at work. You also researched the average life expectancy for women my age in assisted living facilities. 7.3 years, according to your browser history. The crowd's reaction was audible this time. Sharp intakes of breath, whispered conversations that sounded like the buzzing of disturbed insects. Eleanor heard someone say, "Oh my God," and another voice respond, "That poor woman." But Eleanor didn't feel like a poor woman. She felt like someone who had finally found her voice after months of being spoken about rather than spoken to. "Mom," Michael stood up, his legs unsteady beneath him. "You have to believe me. I never wanted to hurt you. Savannah said the guardianship was just paperwork, just in case something happened. She said it would protect you. From what? Eleanor asked. From being taken advantage of, he said desperately. From people who might try to trick you or scam you because you live alone and... like you did. The question stopped in mid-sentence. Eleanor watched her son's face cycle through expressions, denial, rationalization, and finally a dawning horror as he understood what he had actually been part of. "Oh, God," he whispered. "Oh, God, what did I do?" Eleanor felt her anger soften slightly. This was the Michael she remembered, the boy who had cried when he accidentally stepped on a spider, who had spent his allowance buying flowers for her after every school play. Somewhere along the way, that boy had gotten lost, buried under debt in desperation, and a woman who convinced him that love meant betraying his own moral compass. But recognizing the cause didn't erase the effect. "You tried to steal my life," Eleanor said quietly. "You tried to reduce me to a problem that needed solving, a burden that required management. You took my kindness for weakness and my trust for senility." She paused, looking around the ballroom at the faces watching her, some sympathetic, some shocked, all of them focused with the intensity of people witnessing something they would remember and retell for years to come. "But most of all," she continued, "you forgot that I raised you. I taught you right from wrong. I showed you how to treat people with dignity and respect. And when you decided to abandon those lessons for the promise of easy money, you didn't just betray me, you betrayed yourself." Michael dropped back into his chair as if his legs had given out entirely. When he looked up at her, Eleanor saw tears streaming down his face. Not the calculated tears of someone trying to manipulate sympathy, but the genuine anguish of a man confronting the worst version of himself. "I'm sorry," he said, and his voice broke on the words. "Mom, I'm so sorry. I don't know how to fix this." Eleanor studied her son's face, looking for traces of the man she had hoped he would become. She found them there, buried under the shame and fear, but still visible as she looked carefully enough. This was the moment that would define not just their relationship, but the kind of person Michael would be for the rest of his life. She could destroy him here, in front of everyone who mattered to him, and she would be completely justified in doing so. She could take her revenge and walk away, leaving him to clean up the wreckage of his choices. Or she could do something harder. "There is a way," she said finally, "but it requires you to decide who you want to be, Michael. Not who Savannah wants you to be, not who you think I want you to be, but who you are when no one else is making decisions for you." She turned to Raymond, who was watching the exchange with the careful attention of someone who had seen enough family drama to recognize a pivotal moment when it arrived. "Please show them the redemption track documents," she said. Raymond opened his briefcase once more, retrieving a folder that was noticeably thicker than the others. As he spread the documents across the nearest table, Eleanor noticed how the wedding guests pressed closer, their curiosity overcoming their discomfort. This had long since stopped being a private family matter. It had become a public reckoning, and everyone present seemed to understand that they were witnessing something unprecedented. The first document Raymond placed on the table bore an official letterhead and the kind of dense legal language that immediately commanded respect. Eleanor had spent weeks working with him to craft these papers, considering every contingency, every possible outcome of this evening's revelations. "The Redemption Track Program," Raymond announced, "is a comprehensive rehabilitation plan designed by Mrs. Price to offer her family members an opportunity to rebuild trust through demonstrated accountability and genuine change." Savannah looked up from her tear-stained hands, her expression shifting from despair to confusion. "What does that mean?" Eleanor moved closer to the table, her fingers tracing the edge of the document she had spent so many sleepless nights perfecting. "It means I'm not interested in revenge, Savannah. I'm interested in redemption, yours and Michael's. But redemption requires more than apologies. It requires action." She turned to address the broader crowd, understanding that their witness would be crucial to what came next. "For over a year, I've been enabling destructive behavior by providing financial support without accountability. Tonight, that ends, but I'm not abandoning my family entirely. Instead, I'm offering them a path back, if they're willing to take it." Michael wiped his eyes with his sleeve, a gesture so reminiscent of his childhood that Eleanor felt her heart tighten. "What kind of path?" "The first step Eleanor said, consulting the document, is complete financial transparency. You and Savannah will provide Raymond with access to all bank accounts, credit cards, loans, and financial obligations. Everything. No secrets, no hidden debts, no undisclosed expenses. She looked directly at Savannah, including the shopping addiction and the gambling. Savannah's head snapped up. How did you? Priya is very thorough, Eleanor replied calmly. The casino charges on your credit card statements paint a clear picture. So do the online shopping receipts for clothes you've never worn, still hanging in your closet with tags attached. The admission hung in the air like smoke, adding another layer of deception to an evening already heavy with revealed secrets. Eleanor saw Michael look at his wife with an expression of dawning comprehension, as if pieces of a puzzle were finally clicking into place. The second step, Eleanor continued, is accountability through action. Michael, you will take a second job to begin paying back the money you've borrowed from me. The total amount, including interest calculated at current market rates, is $127,000. At your current salary plus additional employment, and with careful budgeting, this debt can be retired in 18 to 24 months. Michael's mouth opened to protest, but Eleanor held up her hand. You will also attend mandatory financial counseling and therapy, both individual and couples counseling, once per week for a minimum of 6 months. The sessions will be paid for through the Redemption Track program, not by you. She turned to Savannah. You will complete 200 hours of community service over the next 12 months, working specifically with seniors and elderly advocacy organizations. You will also enroll in a certified financial planning course and maintain part-time employment while completing your service hours. What if we refuse? Savannah asked, though her voice lacked the defiance from earlier in the evening. Eleanor met her eyes steadily. Then you refuse. I won't force anyone to participate in their own redemption, but understand that refusal means complete financial independence from this point forward. No more rent assistance, no more monthly transfers, no more emergency bailouts. You'll need to figure out how to pay for tonight's wedding expenses on your own, find a way to cover your rent and debts, and build a life without my support. She gestured toward the crowd of wedding guests, many of whom had been listening with the fascination of people watching a particularly compelling television drama. Everyone here will know exactly what happened and why. There will be no story about my declining mental state, no narrative about necessary interventions, just the truth about choices and consequences. Victor Caldwell stepped forward again, his professional composure showing signs of strain. Mrs. Price, I hate to interrupt, but we do need to resolve the matter of tonight's expenses. The club's policy requires. How much? Eleanor asked simply. The total outstanding balance for tonight's event is $58,000, Victor replied. This includes catering, flowers, music, venue rental, and staff charges. Eleanor nodded, as if she had been expecting exactly that number. From her purse, she withdrew a checkbook, not the kind of designer accessory Savannah carried, but a practical blue vinyl folder that she had owned for 15 years. The pen she used to write would have been a gift from the library staff on her 60th birthday. I'll cover tonight's expenses, she announced, her handwriting careful and precise as she filled out the check, but not as a gift, as a loan to Michael and Savannah, to be repaid according to the terms of the Redemption Track program. She tore the check from the book and handed it to Victor, who accepted it with visible relief. However, Eleanor continued, this payment is contingent upon Michael and Savannah publicly acknowledging what has happened here tonight and formally committing to the rehabilitation program. The ballroom fell silent again, but this time the quality of the silence was different. Earlier, the quiet had been shocked and uncomfortable. Now it carried expectation, as if everyone present understood they were about to witness something important. A moment when people either chose to be better than they had been, or revealed themselves to be exactly as small as their worst actions suggested. Michael looked at the check in Victor's hands, then at his mother, then at his wife who sat hunched in her chair like someone trying to disappear entirely. Eleanor could see him calculating. Not just the money, though $60,000 was more than he earned in a year, but the cost of pride, the weight of public admission, the difficulty of acknowledging that he had been wrong about so many things. The community service, he said finally, where would it be? Various senior centers throughout Seattle, Eleanor applied. Meal preparation, companionship visits, technology assistance. The kind of work that helps you understand what elderly people actually need instead of what other people think they need. Savannah looked up, her mascara-streaked face, showing something that might have been hope. And the counseling? Individual therapy to address the underlying issues that led to the gambling and overspending, Eleanor said. Couples counseling to learn how to build a relationship based on honesty rather than shared financial fantasy. And family counseling, so we can all figure out how to be related to each other in healthy ways. She moved closer to the table where the documents lay spread out like a roadmap to rehabilitation. The program includes job placement assistance for both of you, budgeting workshops, and regular check-ins with a financial advisor. It's not designed to be punitive. It's designed to give you the tools you need to build a life that doesn't require lying or manipulation to sustain. Michael stood up slowly, his tuxedo wrinkled and his hair disheveled. Looking nothing like the confident groom who had greeted guests just hours earlier, he walked to the table and picked up the first document, reading it with the careful attention of someone who understood that his next decision would echo through the rest of his life. "Mom," he said, and his voice was quieter than Eleanor had heard it since he was a child. "I need you to know that I never meant for it to go this far. I got scared about money, and Savannah made it sound like we were helping you, and I lost track of what was right." Eleanor studied her son's face, looking for signs of genuine remorse versus the kind of strategic apology that people offer when they've been caught. What she saw was exhaustion, shame, and something that looked like relief. The expression of someone who had been carrying a weight he hadn't even realized was there until it was finally lifted. "I know," she said simply. "That's why I'm offering you this choice instead of just walking away." Michael picked up the pen and signed his name at the bottom of the first document. His signature looked shaky, uncertain, but it was there. He turned to Savannah, holding out the pen with a gesture that somehow managed to be both gentle and firm. "What do you want to do?" he asked her. Savannah looked around the ballroom at the faces watching her. Wedding guests who had come to celebrate love and family, who had instead witnessed betrayal and consequences and the possibility of redemption. Eleanor could see her calculating just as Michael had, weighing pride against practicality, immediate humiliation against long-term consequences. "If I sign this," Savannah said, "does it mean you forgive me?" The question caught Eleanor off guard with its directness. She had been prepared for arguments, negotiations, demands for modifications to program. She hadn't expected such a simple, honest question about forgiveness. "Forgiveness isn't something you earn by signing a document," Eleanor replied. "It's something you build through consistent actions over time. But this program gives you the opportunity to start building it." Savannah nodded slowly, as if the answer made sense to her. She took the pen from Michael and stared at the signature line for a long moment. When she finally signed her name, it was with the deliberate care of someone making a promise she intended to keep. The applause that followed was unexpected. Scattered at first, then growing stronger as more guests joined in. Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes, not from sadness or relief, but from something more complex. Pride, perhaps, in her son's willingness to choose a harder path. Hope that her daughter-in-law might discover better versions of herself through service to others. And a deep satisfaction in having found a way to hold people accountable without destroying them entirely. The applause faded gradually, replaced by the softer sound of an evening finding its new rhythm. Wedding guests began to move around the ballroom again, some heading toward the bar, others gathering in small groups to process what they had witnessed. Eleanor noticed how many of them approached her, not with the careful politeness typically reserved for elderly relatives, but with genuine respect and curiosity. Mrs. Chun from Michael's office shook her hand firmly. "I've never seen anything like that," she said. "The way you handled it, my own mother could learn from you." A young man Eleanor didn't recognize, one of Savannah's friends, she guessed, stopped beside her table. "Ma'am, I just want to say, what you did tonight took real strength. A lot of people would have just cut them off." Eleanor nodded graciously at each comment, but her attention remained focused on Michael and Savannah, who stood together near the signed documents, looking like survivors of a natural disaster, shaken but still standing, uncertain what came next but grateful to have made it through the worst of it. Raymond gathered the papers with practiced efficiency, organizing them into separate folders for each participant. Mrs. Price, I'll have copies prepared for everyone within 48 hours. The first counseling appointment is scheduled for Tuesday at 10 a.m., and I've already contacted the community service coordinator about placement options. What happens now? Michael asked. His voice still carried the hollow quality of someone who had been forced to confront uncomfortable truths about himself. But Eleanor detected something else underneath, a note of genuine curiosity about his own future. Now you go home, Eleanor said simply. You figure out how to live within your means while you work to pay back what you owe. You show up to your counseling appointments and your community service assignments. You make different choices than the ones that brought you here. She looked around the ballroom, noting how the crisis had transformed what should have been a celebration into something more complicated, but perhaps more valuable. And you remember that tonight wasn't about punishment. It was about giving you the chance to become people you can be proud of. Savannah had been quiet since signing the documents, but now she stepped closer to Eleanor with the hesitant movements of someone approaching a wild animal that might flee or attack. Mrs. Price, she said, and for the first time, the title sounded respectful rather than perfunctory. I know I don't have a right to ask this, but will you give us a chance to prove that we could do better? Eleanor studied her daughter-in-law's face, looking past the smeared makeup and tear-stained cheeks to something more fundamental. She saw ambition that had been misdirected, intelligence that had been misused, and desperation that had been allowed to override moral judgment. But she also saw something that might have been genuine remorse, and a flicker of understanding about the difference between wanting things and deserving them. The program gives you that chance, Eleanor replied. What you do with it is up to you. As if summoned by the mention of new beginnings, Nora Bennett appeared at Eleanor's elbow with the kind of perfect timing that comes from decades of friendship. She had been watching from the crowd throughout the evening's drama, providing silent support through her presence alone. Eleanor, Nora said, that was magnificently handled. Richard would have been proud. She used the name of Eleanor's late husband with the easy familiarity of someone who had known them both as a couple, who remembered their shared dreams and private jokes. The mention of Richard sent a wave of complex emotions through Eleanor. He had been gone for 12 years, but she still found herself wanting to share important moments with him. Still caught herself reaching for the phone to tell him about something funny that happened at the library or something troubling she had heard on the news. He would have understood tonight's choices, she thought. Richard had always believed in giving people opportunities to be better than their worst moments and holding them accountable while still leaving room for redemption. It had been his idea, decades ago, to live below their means and invest quietly, building wealth not as an end in itself, but as a form of security that would allow them to be generous when generosity was needed. He would have wanted me to find a way to help them help themselves, Eleanor said quietly. He never believed in solving people's problems for them. No, Nora agreed, but he believed in giving them the tools to solve their own problems. There's a difference. As the evening wound towards conclusion, Eleanor found herself observing the aftermath of crisis with anthropological interest. The wedding guests had reorganized themselves into new configurations, some clearly uncomfortable with what they had witnessed and eager to leave, others energized by the drama and lingering to discuss its implications. She noticed how people looked at her differently now. Earlier in the evening, she had been Michael's mother, a pleasant elderly woman in a sensible dress who could be greeted politely and then forgotten. Now she was someone who commanded attention, whose presence suggested depths that might not be immediately apparent. The transformation fascinated her. She was the same person who had walked into the ballroom hours earlier, wearing the same clothes and carrying the same purse and harboring the same thoughts. But by revealing the extent of her resources and her willingness to use them strategically, she had changed other people's perceptions of who she was and what she was capable of. Victor Caldwell approached with a clipboard and the satisfied expression of a man whose evening had been salvaged at the last possible moment. Mrs. Price, everything is settled with our accounting department. I wanted to thank you for your handling of, well, a difficult situation. Eleanor shook his hand, appreciating his professionalism. Thank you for your patience, Victor. I know this wasn't the kind of wedding reception you typically manage. In 30 years of event planning, he replied, I can honestly say I've never seen anything quite like it. But I have to admit, the way you handled it, it showed real class. A lot of people in your position would have made this much uglier." As he walked away, Eleanor reflected on his words. She could have made it uglier, could have chosen public humiliation over private redemption, could have used her resources as weapons rather than tools for rehabilitation. The temptation had been there, especially in the moments immediately following Savannah's slap, when anger and hurt had threatened to overwhelm her better judgment. But ugliness, she had learned, rarely produced the outcome she actually wanted. She didn't want Michael to be destroyed by his mistakes. She wanted him to learn from them. She didn't want Savannah to be crushed by exposure. She wanted her to develop genuine empathy for the people she had been willing to manipulate. Most of all, she wanted to preserve the possibility that they could all, someday, be a family again, not the dysfunctional family they had been, built on secrets and financial dependency and unspoken resentments, but something healthier and more honest. The ballroom had begun to empty as the evening reached its natural conclusion. Wedding guests gathered their belongings and said their goodbyes, many of them stopping to shake Eleanor's hand or offer words of support. She found herself the center of a receiving line she had never expected, accepting congratulations for a victory she wasn't entirely sure she had won. Michael and Savannah lingered near the head table, uncertain whether they should leave together or separately, unsure of the protocol for departing your own wedding reception after having your life completely restructured in front of everyone you know. Eleanor watched them navigate this new awkwardness and felt a familiar maternal urge to offer guidance, even as she reminded herself that learning to figure things out independently was exactly what they needed to practice. Raymond finished organizing his documents and approached Eleanor with a satisfied expression of an attorney who had managed to resolve a complex situation without litigation. "Mrs. Price, I'll call you tomorrow to discuss the implementation timeline. The first review meeting is scheduled for 2 weeks from today." "Thank you, Raymond," Eleanor said, "for everything. I know this wasn't exactly standard legal work." He smiled, and Eleanor caught a glimpse of the man behind the professional demeanor, someone who genuinely cared about his clients' well-being rather than simply their legal problems. Honestly, it was refreshing to work on a case focused on rehabilitation rather than punishment. Most family financial disputes end with everyone hating each other permanently. As Raymond packed his briefcase and headed toward the exit, Eleanor found herself alone with Michael and Savannah for the first time since the evening's revelations had begun. The silence between them carried a different weight now. Not the heavy tension of unspoken accusations, but the uncertain quiet of people who had said everything that needed saying and weren't sure what came next. "Mom," Michael said finally, "I want you to know that I'm going to do this right. The program, the counseling, paying you back, all of it. I know you don't have any reason to trust me, but I'm going to prove that I could be the son you raised me to be." Eleanor looked at him carefully, searching for signs of the hollow promises that people sometimes make when they're desperate to rebuild bridges they've burned. What she saw instead was exhaustion mixed with determination, the expression of someone who had hit bottom hard enough to recognize solid ground when he found it. "I believe you want to do it right," she said, "but wanting and doing are different things. The program exists because I've learned not to confuse good intentions with reliable behavior." Savannah stepped closer, her wedding dress now wrinkled and stained with tears, her carefully styled hair falling in loose strands around her face. She looked younger without her makeup, more vulnerable, and Eleanor could see glimpses of the woman Michael had fallen in love with beneath the layers of ambition and desperation that had nearly destroyed them both. "Mrs. Price," Savannah said, and her voice carried a humility that Eleanor had never heard from her before. "I know I don't deserve your help after what I've done. The guardianship petition, the lies, the way I treated you, I don't know how to make up for any of that." "You make up for it by becoming someone who wouldn't do those things," Eleanor replied. "By learning to build security through your own efforts rather than by manipulating other people's generosity. By developing genuine concern for elderly people instead of seeing them as obstacles to overcome." She gestured toward the empty ballroom around them, where staff members were beginning to clear tables and fold chairs. "This evening didn't happen because you're fundamentally bad people. It happened because you lost track of your values under pressure, and because I enabled that loss by providing financial support without requiring accountability." Eleanor paused, choosing her next words carefully. These might be the most important sentences she would speak to them, the ones they would remember when the program became difficult or when the temptation arose to take shortcuts or make excuses. "The redemption track isn't charity," she continued. "It's an investment in your marriage, in your character, in the possibility that you can learn to create lives you're proud of rather than lives you need to defend. But like any investment, it only pays returns if you put in the work." Michael nodded, and Eleanor could see him absorbing her words with the focused attention of someone who understood he was receiving instructions for his own rehabilitation. "What if we mess up? What if we try to do everything right, but we still make mistakes?" "Then you acknowledge the mistakes, learn from them, and keep trying," Eleanor said. "The program isn't designed around the assumption that you'll be perfect. It's designed around the assumption that you'll be honest." As they prepared to leave the ballroom, Michael and Savannah to face the complicated process of rebuilding their lives, Eleanor to return to her quiet apartment and process the evening's events, Eleanor felt a complex mixture of emotions: relief that the confrontation was over, anxiety about whether the program would actually work, sadness about the months of deception that had led to this moment, and underneath it all, a stubborn flame of hope that families could heal from even deep betrayals if everyone involved was willing to do the difficult work of change. Nora appeared beside her as they walked toward the parking area, her presence as steady and comforting as it had been throughout their 40 years of friendship. "You did good tonight, Eleanor," she said quietly. "Richard would have been proud, and your mother would have been impressed." Eleanor smiled at the mention of her mother, who had died 15 years earlier, but whose voice Eleanor still heard in moments of moral complexity. Her mother had been the one to teach her that kindness without boundaries was often cruelty in disguise, that helping people sometimes meant allowing them to experience the consequences of their choices. "I just hope it works," Eleanor said as they reached her car, the same reliable Toyota Camry that had been the subject of so much concern from Michael and Savannah. "I hope they're capable of becoming the people this program assumes they can be. And if they're not?" Nora asked. Eleanor considered the question as she unlocked her car door. "Then at least I'll know I offered them every opportunity to choose differently." Sometimes that's all you can do. Create space for people to be better than they've been, and then let them decide whether to fill that space or not. As she drove home to the quiet Seattle streets, Eleanor found herself thinking not about the dramatic confrontations of the evening, but about smaller moments. The way Michael's voice had cracked when he apologized, the genuine confusion in Savannah's eyes when she asked about forgiveness, the unexpected applause from wedding guests who had witnessed something they'd never seen before. Change, Eleanor reflected, rarely happened through grand gestures or dramatic revelations. It happened through daily choices, small acts of courage, and the patient accumulation of better decisions over time. The real test of tonight's events wouldn't come in the ballroom under the scrutiny of wedding guests, but in the quiet moments over the coming months when Michael and Savannah would have to choose between old patterns and new possibilities, between comfortable lies and difficult truths. But for now, she had done what she could. She had created a framework for redemption, established clear boundaries, and offered her family a path back to a relationship built on honesty rather than manipulation. Whether they chose to walk that path remained to be seen. 6 months after the wedding reception that had become a public reckoning, Eleanor sat in her apartment overlooking Lake Union, reviewing the monthly reports that documented her family's progress through the Redemption Track program. The papers were spread across her kitchen table, the same table where she had planned the evening's confrontation, where she had calculated costs and consequences and tried to imagine ways to hold people accountable without destroying them entirely. The reports made for complex reading. Michael had completed 147 hours of his required community service, working primarily with elderly residents at 3 different senior centers. His supervisor's notes described him as initially awkward but increasingly genuine in his interactions with residents, and surprisingly effective at technology support. He had taken a second job as a weekend janitor at a local office building, work that was neither glamorous nor well-paid, but that provided the additional income needed to begin repaying his debts. The couple's counseling sessions, according to the therapist's summary, had been challenging but productive. Michael and Savannah were learning to have conversations about money that didn't involve blame, secrecy, or magical thinking. They had moved to a smaller apartment that fit within their actual budget, had sold Savannah's car and replaced it with used public transportation passes, and had begun the slow process of paying down their credit card debt using a structured plan that prioritized high-interest accounts. Savannah's individual progress was more difficult to measure, but perhaps more significant. Her gambling addiction, which had been more serious than even Eleanor had realized, was being addressed through weekly Gamblers Anonymous meetings and individual therapy sessions. She had completed 68 hours of community service, working primarily with elderly residents who needed assistance with technology, grocery shopping, and companionship visits. The most interesting development, according to program coordinator's notes, was Savannah's apparent aptitude for working with seniors who had been isolated or marginalized by their families. She had developed what the coordinator described as unusual insight into the experience of being underestimated and overlooked, and had become particularly effective at helping elderly people navigate complicated family relationships. Eleanor set down the reports and walked to her living room window, looking out at the lake that had been her daily view for 15 years. The apartment that had been the subject of so much controversy, the 1,200-square-foot space that Michael and Savannah had wanted to force her to abandon, remained exactly as she preferred it. Comfortable, uncluttered, and filled with books, photographs, and mementos from a life fully lived. The irony wasn't lost on her that in trying to control her housing situation, they had made her more determined than ever to maintain her independence. She had no intention of moving to senior living now or in the foreseeable future. Her health remained good, her mind remained sharp, and her daily routine at the library continued to provide purpose and social connection. The phone rang, interrupting her reflection. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize, but the voice on the other end was familiar. Mrs. Price? This is Alexis Ford from King 5 News. I hope you remember me from the interview last month about elderly financial exploitation. Eleanor did remember. The interview had been Raymond's idea, a way to turn their family's private struggle into a broader conversation about the vulnerability of elderly people to well-meaning but destructive interventions by their adult children. The segment had aired during the local evening news and had generated more response than anyone had expected. Of course, Alexis, what can I do for you? I want to follow up on the story we did about your family's Redemption Track program. We've been contacted by several other families dealing with similar situations, and I was wondering if you'd be willing to discuss the model you developed on a broader scale. Eleanor considered the request. Over the past 6 months, she had received dozens of phone calls and letters from people who had seen the news segment or heard about her approach through word of mouth. Adult children struggling with elderly parents they perceived as vulnerable. Elderly parents dealing with adult children whose financial problems had led to manipulative or coercive behavior. Financial advisors and attorneys looking for alternatives to traditional guardianship proceedings. What kind of discussion did you have in mind? We're putting together a panel for next week's community forum segment, Alexis explained. Representatives from the Area Agency on Aging, a geriatric social worker, and an attorney who specializes in elder law. We'd love to have you share your perspective on how families can address these issues without resorting to legal action. Eleanor found herself smiling. 6 months ago, she had been a quiet library worker whose most public role was reading stories to children during weekend programs. Now she was being invited to discuss family financial dynamics on television, as if she were some kind of expert. But perhaps, she reflected, lived experience was its own form of expertise. Perhaps surviving manipulation and finding a way to address it constructively had given her insights worth sharing with other families facing similar challenges. I'd be happy to participate, she said. After ending the call, Eleanor returned to the kitchen table and the monthly reports. There was one more document she needed to review, a letter that had arrived that morning, addressed to her in Savannah's handwriting. The envelope bore no return address, but the paper inside was expensive, the kind used for formal correspondence. Eleanor unfolded it carefully and began to read. Dear Mrs. Price, I know the program doesn't require me to write to you, and I'm not doing this because I think it will earn me any kind of credit toward completing my requirements. I'm writing because there are things I need to say that I couldn't figure out how to say in person. 6 months ago, I slapped you at my own wedding reception because I was desperate and scared and angry at the world for not giving me the life I thought I deserved. I convinced myself that you were the obstacle standing between me and security, between Michael and the success I wanted for him. What I didn't understand then was that security isn't something you can steal from someone else or manipulate someone else into providing. It's something you build through your own choices, your own work, your own integrity. The community service you assigned me has been the hardest thing I've ever done, but also the most important. Working with elderly people who have been abandoned by their families, who have been treated as burdens or problems to be solved, has shown me exactly what I was trying to do to you. I was trying to reduce you to a collection of assets and inconveniences instead of seeing you as a complete person with your own rights and desires and wisdom. I meet with Mrs. Henderson every Tuesday. She's 84 and lives alone in a studio apartment because her daughter moved her out of the family house to rent it to someone else. I help her with her grocery shopping, and sometimes we just sit and talk. She reminds me of you, not physically, but in the way she's determined to maintain her independence even though people keep trying to convince her she's too old to know what's best for herself. Last week, she told me that the worst part of getting older isn't the physical limitations or even the loneliness. It's the way people stop seeing you as a complete person and start seeing you as a problem to be managed. She said people begin talking about you instead of to you, making decisions for you instead of with you. That's exactly what I was doing to you, Mrs. Price. I was so focused on what I wanted from your life that I stopped seeing you as a person who had every right to make your own choices about your own future. I don't know if I'll ever be able to make up for trying to take that away from you. But I want you to know that I understand now what I did, and I'm committed to becoming someone who would never do anything like that again. The program you created didn't just save Michael and me from the consequences of our bad choices. It saved us from becoming people who could live with ourselves after destroying someone we should have loved and protected. Thank you for seeing something that's worth salvaging, and for caring enough to make salvage conditional on real change. Sincerely, Savannah. Eleanor read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and placed it in the folder with the other program documents. She felt a complex mixture of emotions: satisfaction that Savannah seemed to be developing genuine insight, cautious optimism about the possibility of eventual reconciliation, and a deep appreciation for the way difficult experiences could sometimes produce unexpected wisdom. The afternoon sun slanted through her apartment windows, casting familiar shadows across the furniture she had chosen, the books she had collected, the photographs that documented a life lived on her own terms. This space that Michael and Savannah had wanted to take from her remained hers, but more importantly, it remained a symbol of something larger: the right of elderly people to make their own choices, even when those choices seemed incomprehensible to younger family members who equated independence with risk and simplicity with vulnerability. At 70 years old, Eleanor had learned that wisdom often came disguised as problems, that family crises could become opportunities for growth, and that the most powerful response to betrayal was sometimes not revenge, but the patient creation of space for redemption. She looked at her calendar and noted the dates circled in red: Michael's next counseling session, Savannah's community service commitment, the family meeting scheduled for the following month to review their progress and discuss the possibility of modifying the program's requirements. The work of rebuilding trust, she had learned, was slow and unglamorous, measured in small consistencies rather than grand gestures. But it was work worth doing, because families, even damaged families, were worth saving when the people involved were willing to do the difficult work of becoming worthy of each other. 1 year after the wedding reception that had redefined their family, Eleanor stood in the community room of the Greenwood Branch Library, looking out at an audience she never could have imagined addressing. 37 people had come to hear her speak about what the local media had begun calling the Price model for addressing elder financial exploitation within families, adult children and elderly parents, social workers and attorneys, community advocates, and reporters documenting the growing phenomenon of intergenerational financial conflict. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was now considered an expert in family dynamics, when just 12 months earlier she had been struggling to understand why her own son would betray her trust so completely. But expertise, she had learned, sometimes came through surviving difficult experiences rather than studying them from a distance. The question I'm asked most often Eleanor began, her voice carrying clearly across the room with the confidence she had developed through decades of reading stories aloud, is whether I believe Michael and Savannah have truly changed or whether I'm just setting myself up for disappointment. She paused, looking out at faces that reflected genuine curiosity mixed with the skepticism of people who had seen too many family reconciliation attempts end in repeated betrayals. The honest answer is that I don't know if they've changed permanently. What I know is that they've changed measurably. Michael has paid back $47,000 of the money he owed me through working 2 jobs and living within a budget that requires real sacrifice. Savannah has completed all 200 hours of her community service and has continued volunteering an additional 10 hours per week because, according to her supervisor, she's developed genuine relationships with the elderly people she works with. Eleanor gestured toward the back of the room, where Michael and Savannah sat together, looking nervous but determined. They had asked to attend the presentation, not as participants, but as witnesses to their own transformation. More importantly, Eleanor continued, they both learned to have conversations about money, family obligations, and elderly care that are based on reality rather than fantasy, on respect rather than manipulation. She moved closer to the audience, abandoning the podium in favor of the more intimate connection that came from speaking directly to people rather than at them. But the real question isn't whether they've changed permanently. The real question is whether we've created a framework that can handle it if they haven't. The Redemption Track program doesn't depend on perfect behavior or permanent transformation. It depends on accountability, transparency, and consequences that are educational rather than purely punitive. A woman in the third row raised her hand. Mrs. Price, what would you do if they violated the terms of the program? If they went back to their old patterns? Eleanor had been asked this question dozens of times over the past year by reporters and family members and social workers who worked with similar cases. The answer had evolved as she had watched Michael and Savannah navigate the challenges of genuine change. The program has built-in consequences for violations, she replied. Missed counseling sessions result in extended community service requirements. Financial dishonesty triggers increased supervision and reporting requirements. Serious violations, like attempting to manipulate elderly people or hiding significant debts, result in immediate termination of the program and permanent financial independence. She paused, letting the weight of that final consequence settle over the audience. But the most important thing we've learned is that change happens gradually, through daily choices rather than dramatic commitments. The program succeeds because it creates structures that make better choices easier and worse choices harder. It doesn't depend on willpower or good intentions. It depends on systems that support accountability. An elderly man near the front of the room stood up. My daughter wants me moved to assisted living, and she's been pressuring me to sign over power of attorney. How do I know if her concern is genuine or if she's trying to control my assets? Eleanor felt a familiar tightness in her chest. The recognition of her own story reflected in someone else's experience. This was why she had agreed to speak publicly about their family's crisis, why she had participated in interviews and panel discussions despite her natural preference for privacy. Ask direct questions and pay attention to the answers, she said. Ask what specific concerns she has about your current living situation and what evidence she has for those concerns. Ask her to explain exactly how power of attorney would address those concerns and why less invasive alternatives wouldn't work as well. She moved closer to the man, noting the anxiety in his posture, the way his hands gripped the back of the chair in front of him. Most importantly, trust your instincts about your own capabilities. People who genuinely care about your welfare will respect your right to make your own choices, even when they disagree with those choices. People who are trying to control, you will dismiss your preferences as evidence of diminished capacity. After the formal presentation ended, Eleanor found herself surrounded by small groups of people sharing their own stories. Adult children worried about elderly parents who seemed vulnerable, elderly parents concerned about adult children whose financial problems were creating family tension, professionals looking for alternatives to traditional guardianship proceedings that often left everyone feeling hurt and resentful. Michael approached as the crowd began to thin, his expression showing the complex mixture of pride and embarrassment that had characterized most of their interactions over the past year. "Mom," he said, "I wanted to thank you for letting us be here tonight. I know it would have been easier to tell our story without having us here as reminders of how badly we messed up. Eleanor studied her son's face, noting changes that went beyond the physical effects of working 2 jobs and living on a strict budget. The desperate edge that characterized his expression during those final months before the wedding was gone, replaced by something that looked like peace. Not the peace of someone whose problems had been solved, but the peace of someone who had learned to face his problems honestly. Having you here wasn't about making anything easier, Eleanor replied. It was about showing people that redemption is possible when everyone involved is willing to do the work. Savannah joined them, moving with a quiet confidence that had gradually replaced her earlier desperation. She looked different too, not just the obvious changes that came from shopping at thrift stores instead of department stores, or the calluses on her hands from community service work, but something deeper. The frantic energy that had once driven her to manipulate and scheme had been channeled into more productive directions. Mrs. Price, Savannah said, and the title still carried the respect that had developed over months of supervised interactions. I wanted you to know that Mrs. Henderson asked me to tell you something. Eleanor waited, curious about the elderly woman who had become such an important part of Savannah's community service experience. She said that watching me work through the program has given her hope about her own daughter. She's been trying to figure out how to address some similar issues. Not as serious as what we put you through, but the same pattern of adult children making assumptions about what's best for their elderly parents. Savannah paused, choosing her words carefully. She asked if he might be willing to meet with her daughter, not to run another program or anything like that, just to share your perspective as someone who's been through this kind of situation. Eleanor felt a familiar stirring of purpose. Over the past year, she had received dozens of similar requests, from families struggling with financial manipulation, from elderly people trying to maintain their independence, from adult children who recognized destructive patterns in their own behavior but didn't know how to change them. I'd be happy to meet with them, Eleanor said. Have Mrs. Henderson call me at the library as they prepared to leave the community room. Eleanor found herself reflecting on the unexpected directions her life had taken since that evening at Cedar Ridge Country Club. She had never intended to become a public figure or a family counseling advocate. She had simply wanted to address a specific problem with her own family in a way that preserved the possibility of eventual reconciliation. But crisis, she had learned, had a way of revealing capabilities and purposes that might otherwise remain hidden. The same qualities that had enabled her to survive her husband's death, to build a meaningful life as a widow, to maintain her independence despite social pressure to accept diminished expectations. Those same qualities had equipped her to create something larger than a personal solution to a personal problem. Walking to the parking lot with Michael and Savannah, Eleanor noticed how they moved together now. Not with the desperate codependency that had characterized their relationship before the wedding, but with a steady partnership of people who had learned to support each other's growth rather than enable each other's weaknesses. "How's the counseling going?" she asked, a question that had become routine but still mattered. "Hard," Michael replied honestly. "But good. We're learning how to have arguments that actually solve problems instead of just making them worse. And we're learning how to want things without feeling like we deserve them automatically," Savannah added. It sounds simple, but it's actually incredibly difficult when you're used to thinking a desire as justification. They reached Eleanor's car, the same reliable Toyota Camry that had been such a source of concern from a year earlier. Now it simply looked practical, a sensible choice made by someone who understood the difference between frugality and poverty, between simplicity and deprivation. "There's something else we wanted to tell you," Michael said as Eleanor unlocked her car door. "We've been talking about maybe buying a small house in a few years, after we paid off more of our debt and saved up a proper down payment." Eleanor felt a surge of maternal pride mixed with caution. "That sounds like a reasonable goal. How are you planning to make it happen?" "The old-fashioned way," Savannah replied with a smile that carried no trace of her former bitterness. "By living within our means, saving money consistently, and not borrowing against our future to pay for our present." As Eleanor drove home to the familiar Seattle streets, she found herself thinking about the cyclical nature of family patterns, how behaviors and attitudes were passed down through generations, sometimes consciously but more often through unconscious modeling. Her own parents had lived through the Great Depression, had taught her the value of frugality and self-reliance through their example rather than their lectures. She had tried to pass those values on to Michael, but somewhere along the way, the lessons had gotten muddled, perhaps because he had grown up with more security than she had, perhaps because the culture around him celebrated consumption over conservation, perhaps because she had been too willing to provide financial support without requiring the kind of responsibility that builds character. The Redemption Track program, she realized, had been as much about correcting her own mistakes as it had been about addressing Michael and Savannah's. She had learned to distinguish between helping and enabling, between kindness and weakness, between supporting family members and supporting their dysfunction. Back in her apartment, Eleanor made herself a cup of tea and sat at the kitchen table where so many important conversations and decisions had taken place over the past year. The monthly reports from Michael and Savannah's programs were stacked neatly in a folder, documenting progress that was sometimes dramatic but more often incremental. Tomorrow, she would return to her work at the library, helping children with homework and teaching seniors how to navigate technology and managing community outreach programs that connected isolated elderly people with resources and social opportunities. It was work that always felt meaningful, but that had acquired new depth since her experience with family crisis had given her insights into the complex dynamics of intergenerational relationships. She had also agreed to consult with 3 other families over the coming month. Situations involving elderly parents and adult children where financial manipulation and control issues were threatening to destroy relationships that might still be salvageable with the right intervention and structure. The work wasn't glamorous, and it certainly wasn't what she had planned for her retirement years. But it felt important in ways that transcended personal satisfaction. Every family that learned to address these issues constructively was a family that might avoid the kind of legal battles and permanent estrangements that destroyed so many relationships between elderly parents and their adult children. As she prepared for bed, Eleanor caught sight of herself in the bathroom mirror and was struck by how much she had changed over the past year. Not physically, though the stress and resolution of family crisis had left their marks, but in terms of self-perception and purpose. A year ago, she had seen herself as someone whose best years were behind her, whose primary role was to provide quiet support to younger family members while gradually accepting diminished expectations for her own life. Now she saw herself as someone whose accumulated wisdom and experience could be valuable resources for addressing complex social problems. The transformation hadn't been easy or comfortable. There had been moments of doubt, times when she wondered whether she was being too harsh or too lenient, too involved or too distant. There had been setbacks and disappointments, progress that seemed to reverse itself, and occasions when the whole enterprise seemed too complicated and emotionally exhausting to sustain. But there had also been moments of profound satisfaction. When Michael called to tell her about a difficult conversation he had handled well, when Savannah shared insights from her work with elderly people that demonstrated genuine empathy and understanding, when other families reported success with modified versions of the Redemption Track approach. Most importantly, there had been the gradual restoration of something Eleanor had thought might be lost forever, the possibility of honest relationship with her son and daughter-in-law, built on mutual respect rather than financial dependency, on transparency rather than manipulation. As she turned off the lights and settled into bed, Eleanor reflected on the unexpected lessons of the past year. She had learned that confronting betrayal directly didn't have to mean choosing between forgiveness and accountability, that it was possible to create consequences that were both firm and educational. She had learned that elderly people could be simultaneously vulnerable and powerful. That age brought both limitations and freedoms that younger people often fail to understand. Most surprisingly, she had learned that crisis could be a catalyst for growth rather than simply an obstacle to overcome, that the worst moments of family conflict could become opportunities for deeper understanding and more authentic connection if everyone involved was willing to do the difficult work of honest self-examination. The apartment around her was quiet now, filled with the peaceful sounds of life lived on her own terms. Outside her windows, Lake Union reflected the lights of the city she had called home for 40 years, the same view she woke up to every morning, and the same sense of independence she had fought to preserve. In 18 months, Michael and Savannah would complete their formal obligations under the Redemption Track program. But Eleanor suspected that the real work of family healing would continue long after the paperwork was filed and the official requirements were met. Trust, once broken, was rebuilt through consistent actions over time, through choices made daily rather than promises made once. She had given them the framework and the opportunity. Whether they would use it to build the kind of family relationship she hoped for, one based on mutual respect, honest communication, and genuine care for each other's well-being, remained to be seen. But for the first time in over a year, Eleanor fell asleep believing that such a relationship was possible. Not guaranteed, not easy, but possible. And possibility, she had learned, was often the most valuable gift one person could give to another. The chance to become better than they had been, to choose growth over stagnation, to transform crisis into wisdom. In the morning, she would wake up to the same lake view, the same quiet apartment, the same sense of independence she had worked so hard to protect. But she would also wake up to new purposes and unexpected opportunities, to the satisfaction of knowing that even the most devastating family betrayals could sometimes become the foundation for stronger, more honest relationships. The greatest victory Eleanor had discovered wasn't in winning a battle or proving a point. It was in creating space for redemption while maintaining the boundaries that made redemption meaningful. It was in refusing to accept that broken families had to stay broken, while also refusing to pretend that healing could happen without accountability. As sleep took hold, her last conscious thought was of gratitude for the crisis that had revealed hidden strengths, for family members who had chosen difficult growth over comfortable stagnation, and for the unexpected discovery that even at 70 years old, she was still capable of surprising herself with what she could accomplish when circumstances demanded her very best. Eleanor's journey teaches us that genuine kindness requires boundaries, not blind generosity. When we enable destructive behavior in the name of love, we often harm the very people we're trying to help. True compassion sometimes means allowing others to face the consequences of their choices, while offering structured paths to redemption. The story reveals a crucial truth about aging in America. Being elderly doesn't mean being helpless, and living simply doesn't indicate incapacity. Eleanor's quiet lifestyle was a choice, not a limitation. We must challenge assumptions that equate advanced age with diminished judgment, and respect elderly people's right to make their own decisions about their lives, finances, and living situations. Most powerfully, Eleanor demonstrates that accountability and forgiveness aren't opposites. They're partners in healing. Her Redemption Track program shows how we can hold people responsible for harm they've caused while still creating opportunities for genuine change. Rather than choosing between punishment and enabling, we can build frameworks that require growth, transparency, and consistent action over time. The key lesson: don't mistake patience for weakness or boundaries for cruelty. Sometimes the most loving thing we can do is refuse to participate in someone else's dysfunction while leaving the door open for their transformation. Thank you for watching the video. Please comment with number 1 to let me know you have watched the whole video. Please like the video. Subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell to always receive new videos as soon as possible.